For years after his sister's death, Richard Carpenter mostly talked about the music, the arrangements, the chart positions, the studio sessions that turned two kids from Downey, California into one of the best-selling acts of the 1970s. What he said less often, at least in public, was what actually happened to Karen in the years before she died. In interviews given later in his life, including conversations tied to books and documentaries made with his cooperation, Richard has spoken more directly than he once did about his sister's illness, the pressures that surrounded her, and what he believes the people around her, including himself, failed to understand in time. Karen Carpenter was born on March 2, 1950, in New Haven, Connecticut, 3.5 years after her brother Richard, who was born in October 1946. Richard showed an early gift for piano, and by most accounts in family interviews and biographies, including Randy Schmidt's widely cited book Little Girl Blue, The Life of Karen Carpenter, he was recognized early as one with obvious musical promise, taking lessons and absorbing music theory well before his teens. Karen grew up in a house filled with music. Their father, Harold, kept a large record collection spanning jazz, classical, and popular recordings of the era, but her own path into performing came almost by accident, well after Richard's had already begun to take shape. In June 1963, the family relocated from Connecticut to Downey, California, a working-class suburb of Los Angeles. Biographers and the family itself have described a move as driven largely by Richard's opportunities, proximity to recording studios, working musicians, and the wider reach of the Los Angeles music industry that a 13-year-old aspiring pianist and arranger couldn't access from New England. Biographers who have interviewed people close to the family, including Schmidt in Little Girl Blue, describe the adjustment as falling hardest on Karen, who was starting over in a new school in a new state at 13, without the built-in sense of purpose her brother already had. Whatever the emotional cost of that transition, Karen didn't yet have music of her own to anchor her the way Richard did. That would come only after the family had already settled into their new life in Downey. In high school, Karen joined the school band, by her own account mainly to get out of a physical education requirement. She started on glockenspiel and disliked it almost immediately. It felt thin and exposed compared to what she was hearing on her father's records. Then she saw another student playing drums and asked to switch instruments. Her parents agreed to buy her a drum kit, a real expense for a family of their means at the time, and what followed was, by every account from those who knew her, close to obsessive practice. She studied under a local jazz instructor, drilled rudiments and patterns for hours daily, and within roughly a year was tackling material well beyond what most beginners attempt. Richard has said more than once, in interviews given decades later, that it looked as though his sister had been born behind a drum kit, that the instrument seemed to fit her immediately in a way that took most players years to develop. In 1965, when Karen was 15, she and Richard formed a group, first billed as a Richard Carpenter Trio, with Karen on drums. The group had an unusual setup for the era, no dedicated lead vocalist, a tuba doubling as a bass instrument, and arrangements built around Richard's compositions and piano playing. In June 1966, the trio won the Hollywood Bowls Battle of the Bands, a high-profile amateur contest judged by working industry figures, and the win led to a short-lived recording contract with RCA Records. RCA never released the material the trio recorded in the studio, and the group was eventually dropped from the label, a setback biographers describe as discouraging for both siblings, though it didn't end their ambitions. Karen, meanwhile, had already been recognized separately for her drumming, winning a regional band award as a teenager that had nothing to do with her brother's arrangements or ambitions. For a stretch of her adolescence and early adulthood, the drum kit was where she felt most at home on stage, a position slightly removed from the direct spotlight, doing something purely technical and physical that she had mastered almost entirely on her own initiative. Everything changed in scale after Richard and Karen signed with A&M Records in April 1969, at the invitation of label co-founder Herb Alpert, who had heard a demo tape after it had already been turned down by several other labels. Their first album didn't chart, but their second single, a cover of They Long to Be Close to You, became a #1 hit in the summer of 1970 and turned the Carpenters into a major act almost overnight. Richard has since called the arrangement of that song one of his proudest achievements, though he and Karen reportedly disliked the album cover art the label chose for it and were, in his words, essentially told to learn to live with it. Karen was still playing drums on stage in the earliest days of that success, singing while playing, something biographers and fellow musicians have repeatedly noted as a genuinely rare skill, requiring an unusual degree of independence between her voice and her limbs. But as the group's visibility grew, so did pressure from the label and concert promoters about her stage presence. Audiences in large venues complained that they struggled to see a 5'4" drummer seated behind a full kit, and the issue was raised with the label and management as a commercial concern rather than an artistic one. The solution settled on was to move Karen to the front of the stage as a standing vocalist, with a touring drummer, Cubby O'Brien, taking over percussion duties for live shows. Whether or not this change was framed at the time as being in Karen's interest, Richard and biographers writing with the family's cooperation have since described it as a significant loss for her personally. The drum kit had been a place where she felt some measure of control and physical comfort on stage, doing something technical in practice rather than simply standing exposed in front of an audience. Stepping out from behind it as a solo focal point brought a different, far more exposed kind of pressure, tied directly to how she looked rather than only how she played. It was around this same period, according to Richard and multiple biographers, that Karen began dieting seriously, reportedly starting in earnest around 1967, before the group's biggest successes, and intensifying considerably through the early to mid-1970s as fame, a grueling touring schedule, and media scrutiny of her appearance all increased together. Richard has noted in interviews that the touring schedule itself, especially strings of one-night engagements with little rest between shows, was more demanding than it needed to be, and that the group didn't have a manager at the time whose job was to push back on that pace. The Carpenters became enormously successful through the first half of the 1970s. We've only just begun. Rainy Days and Mondays, Top of the World, Yesterday Once More, and other hits, along with multiple Grammy Awards and some of the best-selling records of the decade, eventually surpassing 100 million records sold worldwide. At the same time, Karen's weight loss became increasingly visible to audiences, journalists, and fans, who noticed a change across television appearances and tour photographs from one year to the next even as a band, and its label avoided discussing it publicly. In 1975, the Carpenters canceled the tour, citing Karen's exhaustion and weakened physical condition, without detailing the underlying cause. Anorexia nervosa was barely discussed in mainstream American culture at the time. It would not become a widely recognized and named condition in general public conversation until later in the decade and into the 1980s, and Richard has said plainly, in later interviews, that neither he nor their parents fully understood what they were witnessing, or how medically serious it had already become. Richard has also spoken candidly about his own struggles during roughly the same period, including a dependence on prescription sleep medication that began as a way to manage the exhaustion of touring and recording, and which grew serious enough that he entered treatment in 1979. He has acknowledged that this period left him less able to be present for Karen than he might otherwise have been, at a time when her own condition was worsening and the family had little outside support to lean on. In October 1981, in a British television interview later widely circulated, host Sue Lloyd directly asked Karen about persistent public rumors of anorexia and cited a specific rumored weight on air. Karen denied it firmly on camera, visibly uncomfortable with the question. Off camera, according to biographers including Schmidt, she had by then already sought help. She began working in January 1982 with a New York specialist who treated eating disorders. Richard has said in later interviews that he came to believe this course of treatment ultimately did not save her, and that in the months that followed, her physical health continued to decline through weight control methods that her own specialist later said had undone much of the progress made in therapy sessions. By 1982, her condition had worsened enough that she was hospitalized in New York, where doctors worked to nutritionally stabilize her before she returned home to California. Karen Carpenter died on February 4, 1983, at her parents' home in Downey at the age of 32. The cause of death was heart failure, which medical examiners attributed to complications of anorexia nervosa, specifically the toll that prolonged malnutrition and weight control methods had taken on her heart. She died only a few weeks after appearing in a group photograph with fellow past Grammy winners, looking, in Richard's later description, deceptively well. In the years immediately following her death, Richard mostly spoke about Karen's death in general terms tied to her illness, without going deeply into detail in most interviews. Over time, in interviews conducted as he got older, and in cooperation with biographers and authors working on books about the Carpenters' career, he became more direct. He has confirmed that Karen's anorexia was more severe and lasted longer than the public understood while she was alive. He has said clearly that in the 1970s, almost no one, not the family, not doctors, not the music industry, had the tools or vocabulary to recognize what was happening or intervene effectively. We just didn't know, is how he's put it in more than one interview, describing an era in which eating disorders were barely named, let alone treated with anything like modern clinical understanding. Richard has also pointed to the cumulative weight of touring schedules, media scrutiny of Karen's appearance, and the pressure of maintaining the group's wholesome public image as factors that, alongside whatever personal and family dynamics were also at play, compounded her illness over time. He has been careful, in the interviews where he discusses this, not to reduce it to one single cause, describing it instead as several things converging, some professional, some personal, some medical, none of them fully understood at the time by anyone around her, including Karen herself. What comes through most clearly in Richard's later reflections isn't blame of their parents, of the label, or of himself, so much as regret over how much wasn't said or understood while there was still time. He has described his sister as an extraordinary talent whose voice, in his words, only comes along once every few generations, and has said more than once that he believes she would have continued recording for decades if she'd lived. He keeps a photograph from that final Grammy gathering in his home. Karen Carpenter's story has become, in the decades since her death, one of the most frequently cited cases in public conversations about anorexia nervosa, not because her experience was unique, but because her fame made an illness that had been almost invisible in public discourse impossible to ignore. Richard Carpenter's later willingness to speak plainly about what his sister went through, and what the people around her didn't understand in time, has been part of how that story continues to be told, less as tabloid rumor, and more as a record of a real illness that claimed a genuinely singular voice far too early. This account touches on anorexia nervosa and its fatal consequences. If you or someone you know is struggling with disordered eating, the National Alliance for Eating Disorders operates a helpline and can help connect people with appropriate support and treatment resources.